Welcome to Not Entirely Unlike Tea with Christine Collins. Hey there, it's Christine Collins, and today we have this fun topic around frenemies versus enemies. Now, one of the things that happens when we experience toxic communication from anyone is that toxic communication triggers our threat response systems. It activates the amygdala, which keeps us in a state of hypervigilance. There's stress hormone release like cortisol and adrenaline, and then a number of other things which over a span of time can lead to what's known as allostatic load or accumulated stress damage. So repeated stress activation, continuous stress hormone release, inadequate recovery time, and we end up with system exhaustion. That can affect our immune system, cardiovascular strain, cognitive decline, energy depletion, and even sleep disruption. So the question is, why is it that ambiguous toxic communication can actually be worse for us than overt toxic communication, which is kind of known and understood, versus someone who's supposed to be in your corner, on your team, whether that's friend, family, or close acquaintance? So one of the things that happens is there is a confusion in the brain and body in terms of how to respond. On the one hand, our threat detection system is going off, it's sensing danger, it's noticing some hostile comments. On the other hand, our social reward system is trying to have connection and engagement with the person. And it creates an internal state of dissonance, which is highly taxing on our brain. So when we have a more clear threat, it triggers a very defined fight or flight response. But an ambiguous threat can actually cause a more prolonged, low-grade stress response with elevated cortisol, which never fully activates or resolves. We end up with a chronic allostatic load or long-term stress on the whole system, and it disrupts the normal stress recovery cycles. We have mirror neuron systems which help us to understand other people's intentions, and that can become overloaded trying to process, is this good or is this bad? We have the anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved with conflict monitoring. The prefrontal cortex is trying to make sense of things that seem contradictory. And then we end up with these contradictory beliefs, like this person cares about me on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're hurting me. Are they my friend? Are they my competitor? Are they my family who's supportive and cares about me? Or are they hurting me? I should trust them versus I should be wary of them. Now this gets tricky because when we have someone who we consider sort of a clear-cut enemy, someone that we really don't want to engage with, it doesn't activate our attachment system. But the so-called frenemy can activate an anxious attachment pattern because we can't seem to fully engage and relax into it with trust, but we also can't fully disengage and cut off that contact. And so the relationship is alternating between rewarding and punishing, and can actually create a traumatic bonding pattern. Ambiguous toxic communication can often involve things like gaslighting, plausible deniability, meaning they can sort of skate out of what they've said later if you do try to come back and hold them accountable, social manipulation, and subtle undermining. And over time, this can erode our trust in our own judgment and in our own ability to accurately assess situations. When we have a more clear-cut threat, we automatically go into creating strong boundaries around ourselves. But when it's more ambiguous, it's more difficult to set consistent boundaries, to trust our instincts, and even to justify to ourselves protective measures and boundaries. It can even feel very tricky to explain the situation to other people that we might be leaning on for different support, because it's supposed to be a friend, it's supposed to be family, it's supposed to be someone that we can trust. And over time, what this does is it activates this ongoing sustained vigilance. The default mode network, which is responsible for social processing and narrative processing, the salience network, which deals with threat assessment, and the executive network, which deals with decision making, are constantly needing to be activated. And all of this together, as you can imagine, is extremely energy intensive. There's a lot of work that goes into maintaining this kind of setup. Then we start screening every communication to try to assess, is this a positive communication or potentially negative and toxic communication? Now, there are some examples, concrete examples, around some things that are more subtle. So most of us are familiar with what overt toxic communication would look like and feel like, but identifying it in these ambiguous situations can be a little bit more tricky, and that can be where we end up second guessing ourselves and our instincts. When we see a pattern of certain types of language and statements like you need to, you should, you must, kind of bossy, pushy language, things that create a false sense of obligation, things that imply your inadequacy, things that challenge your decision-making and your autonomy to make decisions, things that induce guilt or shame, other guilt-based manipulation strategies like after everything I've done for you, ... Everyone else thinks ... I'm just trying to help you ... If you really cared ... I'm saying this for your own good ... Someone like you should ... And so having some planned responses as well as some understanding around how to set healthy boundaries can be extremely helpful in these scenarios. Playing around with your own language to make sure that you are being both clear and kind, not succumbing to sort of fall into that trap and begin engaging in conflict, but also holding firm and clear to your own boundaries and standards. Things like, I make my own decisions about my needs or my health. I'm comfortable with the choices that I'm making right now. Thank you for your input, but I'll have to decide what works the best for me. I have my own process for handling these things. I trust my judgment on this. I have already carefully considered my approach. My decisions aren't related to my relationship with you. The choices that I'm making and your feelings about them are two separate things. I've noted your concern, but I'm still confident in my approach. I just have my own standards for what I think success looks like. And then even asking some questions. So someone that says something like, you're so brave to wear something like that. And then responding with, well, what do you mean by brave? And kind of challenging them if you want to even do that. Of course, a simple statement would probably shut it down faster, but sometimes that's enough to get them to stop pursuing that line of commentary. And you can be more direct as well, saying things like, that sounds a lot like criticism wrapped up in a compliment. Or, that feels a lot like you're trying to guilt trip me and it makes me uncomfortable. And then of course you can always just redirect if you're most comfortable simply changing the subject into something like, well, let's talk about this instead. Let's focus on this topic. This is what we're here to accomplish. This is what we're here to figure out. So keeping those I statements, I've decided, I'm comfortable with, I prefer, keeping it as factual as possible, and while it can be difficult, as non-emotional as possible. Some of the most important pieces are recognizing those manipulation attempts early on, seeing them for what they are so that you don't start to fall into that bait that's being laid for you, where you'll begin to get emotionally engaged. Keeping some emotional distance while trusting your perceptions and staying grounded in your values and your choices. And when we create really good, healthy boundaries, we activate the prefrontal cortex, which is our brain's executive center, and it also helps to regulate and mitigate the amygdala's threat response. So it can kind of calm us down to sort of stay objective and logical and to set clear boundaries. And over time, that will strengthen the neural pathways for our emotional regulation. And by doing some emotional distancing, we get some psychological space between ourselves and those toxic messages. We get less emotionally entangled in other people's dysfunction or whatever it is that's going on with them. And our sense of self becomes a little more stable and less dependent on their opinions and their comments. And it becomes like a skill that develops more strongly over time. Through those building of new neural pathways, strengthening the pathways that have built the boundaries, the interior cingulate cortex becomes better at monitoring our emotional states and noticing when we start to feel those red flags going up, we develop a greater sense of awareness for the future. And then our social cognition networks become more discerning. We have better recognition of authentic versus manipulative communication. Our mirror neuron systems become more selective in responses, and we learn how to interrupt the stress response that starts to happen automatically when those messages start coming in. We start feeling all of the emotions and the reactions, whether it's anger or stress or worry or guilt or any of those things, we learn how to disrupt that stress response cycle and prevent ourselves from absorbing those negative messages and taking them in, making them an internal message. And ultimately, this will create better, closer, healthier relationships. So when we're getting like invasive questions from someone that we don't want to open up to and share about that topic, simple statements like, that's not really something that I like to discuss at work or people I don't know very well, or I just tend to keep those matters private, really either with myself or just my partner or whomever that is. But thank you so much for showing your concern. I'm not comfortable getting into all of that. And then also time protection. So I can give you 10 minutes right now and then I need to get back to doing something. Or let me take a look at my calendar and we can set up a time in the future. Or I'll need to have a look at this later. I can't do that right now. You can get more clear, more direct, more firm if needed. I've already made my decision and just leave it at that. I appreciate your input, but I'm going forward with this plan. Or this is what works best for me. And of course, if it's extremely toxic, there are lots more things you can say, just simply, I don't engage with that kind of language or not responding at all. But since this is more focused on those ambiguous communications, it's not so much that someone is really coming at you and like cussing you out or something. It is more those subtle toxic messages that feel invasive, they feel pushy, they feel manipulative, they feel guilt-tripping, and they feel like someone is trying to get you to do or say something apart from what you want to do or say. And that's where having really good awareness and really paying attention to your own instinct, noticing your own emotions rising in response to what's being said or done can be extremely helpful. And then there are some other strategies in addition to verbal responses, some things that you can do to support your body and your whole system during that stress response. So micro movements for tension release, things like toe scrunching and releasing, finger stretching, shoulder rolls, relaxing your jaw, relaxing your tongue, ankle rotations, slight movements in your posture, twisting your spine, stretching your hand, or rolling your neck. And then when you're on your own, if you're coming out of an interaction that felt really stressful, you can do some movement, whether it's some yoga, some deep breathing, or gentle exercising, things that activate your parasympathetic nervous system response. Exposure to nature is really helpful. Extended exhale breathing, humming and singing, or loud sighing. And cognitively, it can be helpful to go into situations if you know that you've kind of had a tricky relationship with someone in the past, coming in with pre-planned responses, coming in with clear boundaries, an exit strategy, a way to get yourself out of the situation if it starts to escalate or feel out of control for you, and then having support networks built around you for what you'll do after. And that's where things like self-care can be very valuable following an exchange. Doing things like maintaining your regular sleep patterns, eating habits, things that overall support your health and well-being. Keeping the topic in sort of a mental box that you only take out periodically as opposed to ruminating and dwelling on it for long stretches of time, allowing yourself just brief periods where you deal with that topic and then you put it back away again. It can be helpful to distance yourself mentally by thinking about it from an outsider's point of view, bird's eye view, or viewing the whole scene as if it were a scene in a movie, using kind of a third-party perspective. Distancing yourself from it in terms of time. How will this even matter in a year? What will my future self think about this scenario? You can use curiosity, noticing and observing your emotions and your responses without judgment, and also just forgiving yourself if you don't always respond in exactly the perfect way that you wish that you had in the moment, understanding that it's a learning process how to manage these difficult and challenging scenarios, and that you will get better at it with time and practice, and not every exchange is going to be you doing the shining perfect thing in every scenario, but always doing your best to maintain your own emotional self-control as best as possible. So I hope you found this to be helpful, and if you feel like you need some additional mindset support to help get you through various different challenges, tools like hypnosis, yoga nidra, and EFT tapping breathing can be especially valuable. I love to use them sequentially, starting with EFT. When there's the highest nervous system arousal, it can be very useful in calming yourself down, followed by a yoga nidra or a hypnosis audio. And all three of them are available in my Mindset membership, which you can peek at the details for in the show notes. So until we connect the next time, I wish you the most magical and creative rest of your day. Thanks for listening. This is Christine Collins at transformcreate.com.